Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Chapter 4. We're getting into the tissue level of organization. So we've talked about cells, and we've actually talked about the molecules that make up the cells. Cells, when they come together and they perform a common function, they are termed tissues. And there are 4 tissue types that we're going to focus on in this chapter. So before I go over those tissue types, I want to show you what tissues look like. So this is a photomicrograph of epithelial tissue. This is actually from the lungs, and I believe it's from the lungs. And so here you have simple columnar epithelium, and you can see like the little tiny columns right there. Deep to that you have connective tissue. Over here we have cancerous epithelial tissue. So this is what cancerous tissue looks like. The 4 types of tissue are epithelial tissue, which is your covering and lining tissue. So it covers the body, it lines the majority of all of our organs, lines our joints. We have connective tissue, which is the most common type of tissue in the body, provides protection, binding, gives us form. So bone is considered connective tissue, as is blood. We have muscle tissue. There are 3 types of muscle tissue. We have heart muscle tissue, we have skeletal muscle tissue, and then we have smooth muscle tissue that surrounds the majority of our organs inside our body. And then we have nervous tissue composed of 2 major cell types, neurons, which actually send and receive signals. And then we have neuroglial cells that protect the neurons and kind of maintain that chemical environment. So all of these tissues came from the same undifferentiated cell, and that is called a zygote. The zygote is a totipotent stem cell that eventually undergoes multiple mitotic divisions and specializations. And by the end of week 3, we no longer have a single cell. We have a multicellular organism that has 3 different germ layers. We have the ectoderm, the mesoderm, and the endoderm. So the ectoderm is the layer of or is the germ layer that gives rise to skin, eyes, our nervous system. The mesoderm gives rise to all of our connective tissues as well as our muscle tissues. And then the endoderm gives rise to the majority of our GI tract, reproductive organs, some of our respiratory structures as well that are internal. So each of these layers, ectoderm cells, mesoderm cells, and endoderm cells, end up having or being considered pluripotent stem cells that can still differentiate into different types of cells, but they are on a track to becoming one of a few given cells. So these different tissues then help to make up our membranes. Membranes are composed mainly of epithelial tissue and then connective tissue. Epithelium lines the body, and so it's found surrounding our organs, surrounding our joints, and covering our body. And then deep to our epithelium, we always have a layer of areolar connective tissue, which feeds our epithelium. So the different membranes, we have a cutaneous membrane, that's our dry membrane. It's also known as our skin, or epidermis. We have a serous membrane, which we've talked about, that surrounds the organs in our thoracic and abdominal pelvic cavities, prevents friction as organs move past each other. We have mucous membranes that contain ciliated epithelium that moves mucus away from the body towards the external environment so that we can be protected from potential pathogens trying to get in. So we have a mucous membrane anywhere that there's an opening into the body. We have mucous membranes in our nasal passageways, our mouth, and our vaginal passageway through the penis. We have mucous membranes in the anal region as well. And then we have synovial membranes surrounding all of our movable joints that produce synovial fluid, which helps to protect and maintain our joints, our movable joints. So I found these pictures off of Google Images, as I have here. This is where you can actually find this picture. Here you can see the skin, and you can see the mucous membranes of the nasal and oral cavities going into the respiratory route as well as the digestive route. So we have both our cutaneous membrane and our mucous membrane. Here we are seeing serous membranes surrounding those same organs that we've talked about in the past, the pleural lining, pericardial lining, and the peritoneal lining surrounding our organs. And then here we have our synovial joint. And so the synovial membrane composed of epithelial cells that produce synovial fluid with an underlying areolar connective tissue that feeds the epithelium. So we're going to talk about each of these tissue types more in depth now, and we'll go through each type of each tissue type within these groupings, these broad categories. So epithelial tissue is covering and lining tissue. It covers our body, it lines the majority of our cavities, lines our joints, and it forms most of our glandular tissues, both exocrine and endocrine glands. Epithelium is avascular, so it cannot gain nutrients. It doesn't gain nutrients from the blood. It has to gain nutrients from diffusion of nutrients from other tissues. And the tissue type that feeds it is connective tissue, areolar connective tissue. Makes up the basement membrane for all of our epithelium and feeds the epithelium. Epithelial tissue makes up junctions. So junctions are structures that either bind cells together or so they either bind cells together or they allow for communication from one cell to another cell. And so the type of cell junctions we see within epithelium are tight junctions, and this is an example of a tight junction. Tight junctions are junctions that form a leak-proof barrier between cells. So we see tight junctions in areas where we want no fluids or no materials to move from one side to the other side of the membrane or between cells. And so we see these in like the bladder and our digestive tract. We see tight junctions. We have gap junctions in areas where we need communication. So here you see these tiny little gaps, little holes that allow for communications between one cell and another cell. So those are little gap junctions that allow for communication between the cells. We'll see these in our neurons as well as in cardiac muscle and in epithelial tissue. Desmosomes are, or adherence junctions, are junctions that provide protection against stress. So epithelial tissue has a lot of stress associated with it. Think about your skin and the pressure that is exerted on the skin all the time, moving materials across the skin, so rubbing your skin, putting lotion on your skin, putting clothes on, taking clothes off, scratching your skin. All of these put pressure, mechanical stress on the skin, and so we have to have these special junctions that protect our skin and protect epithelium in general. And that's what desmosomes adherence junctions do. We also see desmosomes in tissues like cardiac muscle, which also has a lot of mechanical stress on it. So as the heart is pumping and constantly beating, it's got a lot of that mechanical stress associated with it. And so we have these desmosomes there as well. And then hemidesmosomes are half of the desmosome. They hold epithelial tissue to underlying connective tissue, areolar connective tissue, which makes up the basement membrane. The basic functions of epithelium depend on their structure. So remember, structure determines function. And so structurally, you can have epithelium that is a single layer thick, or you can have multiple layers of epithelium. That will determine the types of functions that they have. But epithelial tissue has different types of functions associated with them. Depending on the type, epithelium can be very protective. It can be permeable, so allow for diffusion or filtration. It functions in secretion, so it can release nutrients or chemicals. Think of exocrine glands releasing sweat, or endocrine glands releasing hormones. Sensations. Epithelial tissue has nervous innervation, and so those nerves can send signals that allow us to have sensations. And think about it. Your skin is very sensitive. Anybody touching your skin, you feel that. So how do we classify epithelium? We first classify it by how many layers it has. So structurally, we look at how many layers, and then structurally, we look at what is the shape of the top layer. So the top layer of epithelium is known as the apical surface, or the apical layer. The bottom layer is called the basal surface, or the basal layer. If it's one single layer thick, it is simple. If it is multiple layers thick, it is stratified. And so the first classification, again, is how many layers thick. So here we have a simple epithelium, and here we have a stratified epithelium. Simple epithelium is one layer thick. Stratified is multiple layers thick. You can have flat epithelium, which is called squamous. You can have cuboidal epithelium, which is called cuboidal. You can have column-shaped epithelium, which is called columnar. So if you have a single layer of epithelium and they are flat, they're called simple squamous. If it is cube-shaped, simple cuboidal. If it is column-shaped, it's simple columnar. If it is more than one layer, two or more layers, then you have stratified, but you still look at the top layer to see what type. Stratified squamous, stratified cuboidal, stratified columnar. So if you look here, you see that the bottom layers are more cuboidal than they are flat, because stratified squamous epithelium, the only layer that has to be flat to be squamous is the top apical layer. The lower layers tend to be more cuboid in shape. And then we have some epithelium that is called pseudostratified. Pseudostratified is a simple epithelium, but it looks like it's stratified. So here you see multiple layers of the nuclei. All of these are the little nuclei. And here you see multiple layers again. The difference is all of these cells are hitting that basement membrane. Sometimes not all the cells hit the apical surface, but they all hit that basement membrane, and that's what counts. So I like this figure better for pseudostratified. It really shows what pseudostratified looks like. So here we have a nucleus in a cell. It's going all the way down. Here we have another cell that doesn't hit that apical surface, but it's at the basement membrane. Here's another one that hits that apical surface, or hits the basement membrane. It just doesn't hit the apical surface. Here's another one that does hit the basement membrane and the apical surface. There's another one. So you see how they're all hitting that basement membrane, just not the apical surface. That means that this is a simple epithelium, but it looks stratified. So pseudostratified means that it's falsely stratified. It's actually a simple epithelium. So here is a simple columnar epithelium. Each of these, the nuclei are all in roughly the same area. Here is a pseudostratified epithelium, columnar epithelium. So it looks like we have multiple layers of the nuclei. In our columnar epithelium, very often we have specialized cells called goblet cells. Goblet cells kind of look like little goblets, and that's where they got their names. They look like the wine glass, wine goblets. They produce a chemical called mucin, which when it comes in contact with water, it produces mucus. And so mucus is secreted, and most of these cells have cilia associated with it, or they might have microvilli associated with it. And then the cilia will move that mucus towards or away from some opening. So this is ciliated simple columnar in our digestive tract. Or not, I'm sorry, not ciliated. This is simple columnar epithelium of our small intestines. It's going to contain microvilli at the surface. The mucus is secreted to help protect our intestinal walls. I talked about the shape, but I'll quickly go over them again. Squamous shape means it's flat and it's wide. So here you have very flat cells. When you look at them under a microscope, oftentimes they look like little flat fried eggs with a nucleus right in the very middle. When you have cuboidal shaped cells, the cells are all cube-shaped, which is where they get their name, and the nuclei tend to be right in the center of the cell. And then columnar cells have more like a rectangular structure, column structure, with the nuclei sitting at the basal region, very low to the cell. So here is simple squamous epithelium. You see the squamous shaped cells on the top here. Down here you see that you have cuboidal shaped cells. So I want to show that too. And in between we have some connective tissue. But this is simple squamous epithelium right there. We find simple squamous epithelium lining the alveoli of our lungs. They line our capillaries as well as our lymphatic vessels, and they form mesothelium of our serous membranes. Here is simple cuboidal epithelium, so you can see the simple cuboidal. Simple cuboidal epithelium lines the majority of our glandular tissue, and it surrounds the lumen or the opening of those glands. I did not talk, so I'm going to go back for just a second, okay? I didn't talk about function. This is very flattened, thin layer of epithelium. Its major function is going to be diffusion and filtration of material, so movement of molecules across the surface. Whereas this one is also going to be for secreting materials, potentially diffusion of nutrients, filtration of materials across the surface as well. It doesn't, so your simple epithelium does not tend to be very protective. Here's simple columnar epithelium. Simple columnar epithelium can be ciliated or non-ciliated. If it's non-ciliated, it typically has microvilli, so that's where you're going to find a border that increases surface area for absorption. So one of the major functions is secretion and absorption of the materials. If it's ciliated, it functions typically in secretion, absorption, and then movement of the materials along the walls. So non-ciliated we find in our digestive tract. Ciliated we find in fallopian tubes as well as in our respiratory tract. And here you can see the ciliated simple columnar. Pseudostratified epithelium, or pseudostratified columnar epithelium. Here's a beautiful goblet. So that is just gorgeous right there. You can see those cilia really nice up here. Can be ciliated or non-ciliated. Functions similar to your simple columnar, so secretion and absorption of materials. Ciliated, found in our respiratory tract. Non-ciliated, very few places. The male urethra and epididymis are places where you'll find non-ciliated pseudostratified columnar epithelium. Stratified squamous epithelium. So here it's again flattened at the apical surface. When you go down lower, you'll see that it looks more cuboidal, but we are only looking at the apical surface, okay? It's stratified epithelium, and its major function is to protect against any type of mechanical stress, so abrasions, frictions. The deepest layer is connected to the basement membrane, which is areolar connective tissue. Apical surface is flattened, which is where it gets its name. It can be either keratinized or non-keratinized. Keratinized is your dry cutaneous membrane, makes up that cutaneous membrane, and this is keratinized stratified squamous up here. Non-keratinized, the apical surface contains living squamous cells. This is what we find in our mucous membranes, at least in specific regions of our body. So in our mouth, vaginal region, you have stratified squamous, anywhere where you're going to have potential friction, abrasion, or any stressors. So in the non-keratinized, all the cells are living. They can all gain nutrients because this is a moist membrane. And so areolar connective tissue can feed the tissue and the nutrients can diffuse all the way through. Whereas non-keratinized, the apical surface, or whereas keratinized, the apical surface cannot get nutrients because this is a dry membrane, and so the nutrients can only diffuse up from the basal layer to sometimes the squamous layer, and that's about it. As the cells fill with keratin, they die, and so the apical surface is composed of completely dead cells. Stratified cuboidal epithelium is found in most of our glandular tissue, both exocrine and endocrine glands. It functions in protection. There's not a lot of other areas. We see them in sweat glands, in other exocrine glands, as well as in the male urethra. And then stratified columnar epithelium functions mainly, again, in protection. And very rare, it's mainly found in the male urethra. So here you can see the stratified columnar epithelium. The last epithelial tissue we'll talk about is transitional epithelium, and then I'll stop this video. transitional epithelium is named for the fact that it changes shape often depending on the state that the tissue's in. So it's found in areas where you have a lot of stretching, and so the bladder is one of the only areas where you find transitional epithelium. It's found in the bladder as well as in the ureters. It lines the ureters. And its function is to distend or stretch as the bladder and the ureters fill. And then as the bladder releases urine, the tissue goes back to its relaxed stage and it changes in shape. So the apical surface can be cuboidal all the way down to squamous shaped, whereas the basal surface is almost always going to be cuboidal in shape. So there's your different epithelial tissues. I'm going to stop here and then we'll go to the next video on connective tissues, okay?